8 feature-length motion pictures, more than a half a dozen animated shows, a live-action TV series. Factor in the character's countless print appearances, and there are few fictional creations quite as successful as The Amazing Spider-Man. From the game console to the toy box and down every road in between, the Webhead's ubiquity is matched by few. Indeed, a recent analysis of Google search rhythms has shown Spider-Man to be the top of the heap in over 50 countries worldwide. No small potatoes considering the seemingly endless stream of IPs competing for the consumer's attention. But this ubiquity didn't occur overnight. Spidey's road to success would be a long journey, one punctuated by all manner of stops, detours, and pullovers. And it's all here at breakfast.
Breakfast!
Good morning and welcome to Comics for Breakfast. I'm your host, Jason Mink. The final issue of Marvel Comics' Amazing Fantasy hit the newsstand on the 1st of August, 1962. Formerly known as Amazing Adult Fantasy, there was little to set this comic apart from other code-approved sci-fi anthologies on the newsstand at the time. Filled with short, by-the-book stories, the wooden plotting and twist endings generated little interest in readers, leading to the title's eventual cancellation. However, tucked into the final issue would be a tale that broke out of publisher Martin Goodman's imposed framework, capturing readers' imagination in a way few of the publisher's other titles could. Much has been written about Spider-Man. It's unquestionably one of the most discussed tales of comics' Silver Age. In a nutshell, timid teenager Peter Parker is an outsider. Ostracized for his love of science and sweater vests, Peter prefers the company of his aunt and uncle, whom he's lived with since his parents' mysterious disappearance. After being rebuked by his classmates, Peter hoofs it to a nearby scientific exhibit on radioactivity. During the demonstration of the device, a common house spider is exposed to the powerful radiation, which it then passes through its dying bite to Peter. The teen immediately feels ill, slipping outside, where he discovers the unusual changes already occurring within his body. Now able to leap great distances, climb walls, and vandalize helpless pipes, Peter ponders his next move. Soon, the germ of an idea takes root in the teenager's mind. Why not use these new unexpected abilities for his own benefit? Peter decides to enter a local wrestling competition for a shot at the $100 prize. He wins the contest easily, curious considering how much he's cheating and all. Struck by the kid's gimmick, a TV producer emerges from the crowd, giving the enigmatic young performer his card. Taken by the idea of stardom, Peter whips himself up an eye-catching costume and a shockingly innovative set of web shooters, wrist-mounted devices which dispense a versatile polymer fluid of his own creation. After taking them for a spin, so to speak, Peter launches into his new career as the Amazing Spider-Man. Stunned by his unusual appearance and uncanny powers, Spider-Man's television debut makes him an immediate sensation. However, the sudden rush of fame goes to Peter's head, and he allows a fleeing criminal to escape, an act that will have unforeseen consequences. In the days that follow, Spider-Man's fame only grows, but when Peter learns of his uncle's murder by an intruder, his desire for fame is forgotten. Changing into his colorful alter ego, Peter streaks across town, slipping into the surrounded warehouse and quickly locating the hiding suspect. Spider-Man emerges from the shadows, disarming the criminal before knocking him out with a single blow. Drawing close, the masked teen gets a second and even worse shock upon discovering his uncle's killer is, in fact, the robber he'd allowed to go free mere days earlier. Sobered by this discovery, the stunned teen wanders off into the night, realizing only too late that, with great power, comes great responsibility. Coming at the end of the title's run, Lee expected his little story to quickly be forgotten, leaving the creator in need of fresh ideas and concepts. However, a strange thing happened. The sales figures for the final quarter of 1962 showed Amazing Fantasy number 15 to have sold far better than previous issues. Whether it was the result of the striking Jack Kirby cover or the quirky Lee Ditko concept and execution, the book's noticeable bump led to the publication of Amazing Spider-Man number 1 in March of 1963. The book featured the same Lee Ditko team, this time positioned to tell ongoing stories of Marvel's unlikely new character, and tell stories they did. In the space of just 12 issues, the team introduced no fewer than 10 villains, most of which went on to iconic status in their own right. Every month, Lee and Ditko amazed readers with their unconventional tales featuring a new kind of hero, one that kids of the era could relate to. This wasn't some idealized yet ultimately alien Ubermensch, morally upright granite-jawed adult. Peter Parker, and by extension Spider-Man, was a compellingly flawed character prone to self-doubt, anger, and even fear. Unlike the reassuringly adult DC heroes, there was an element of risk and danger to Spidey's actions. If something happened to this kid while he was out poking his nose around into the worst kind of trouble he could find, well, who would know? And more importantly, who would take care of Aunt May? In spite of the success of titles like the Fantastic Four or the Avengers, it was Spider-Man who quickly became the face of Marvel Comics. Artist Steve Ditko's singular style underscored the character's unusual appearance, creating an instantly recognizable icon with no equivalent. Spidey soon began guest starring in other Marvel titles, his appearance a guaranteed selling point. But there were only so many comics that Lee and Company could shoehorn the Webhead into, and Martin Goodman could still hear nickels tinkling in children's pockets. And so the mighty Marvel Annual was born. Okay, maybe this seems like a crass take, considering how many great stories readers would get in the space of just a few years. However, Marvel was never shy about producing content, and readers certainly weren't shy about buying it. The company had already issued Fantastic Four Annual number 1 in July of 1963. Unlike previous large-sized books, FF Annual number 1 contained an original, full-length story for readers who couldn't get enough of the monthly book. Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 1 would follow suit. With a cover date of October of 1964, the book hit newsstands in July, featuring a new Lee Ditko story featuring not one, but 6 of Spidey's most nefarious villains. Not only that, but the tale featured guest appearances from pretty much everyone in the Marvel Universe. Sounds too good to be true? Well, no need to risk your imaginary 2 bits, Charlie. I've got the breakdown right here. Our tale begins as all the best adventure yarns do, with our nearly nude hero cowering in a corner. And who could blame him? He's recently crossed up Dr. Otto Octavius, one-time scientist turned supervillain, and here's the doc now, casting a mental command to his nearby robotic prosthesis. The agitated arms break free from their confinement, releasing their master from his cell. Later, across town, Spider-Man is getting caught up on the day's headlines courtesy of the Daily Bugle. He learns his foe has escaped imprisonment, but before he can react, he's knocked ass over tea kettle by a passing Thor. Across town, the first meeting of the Secret Six has been called to order, so smoke 'em if you got 'em. Elsewhere, tiresome stereotype Flash Thompson hassles our boy Peter, but the unexpected appearance of Doctor Strange's ectoplasmic form disrupts the horseplay. Leaning into this helpful distraction, Peter slips away to become Spider-Man, trailing a fellow who's tripped off his spider sense. And no wonder, it's the Sandman who manages to escape into a nearby sewer grate. Unable to track his quarry, Peter returns home to discover Aunt May mourning in the attic. During a recap of his origin, Peter falters while walking a narrow ledge, barely catching himself before falling into the concrete canyons below. To his horror, his spider powers have abandoned him, leaving the now helpless teenager stranded high above the city. Passing by, the Fantastic Four take note of the struggling hero, but assume he's just putting them on. Seems like an odd joke to make, but hey, it takes all kinds. Peter makes his way down to the street, leading to this hilarious panel of Webhead shushing a dog. Returning home, Peter assures a concerned Aunt May he's fine, while the Sinister Six have finally assembled. The plan is this. Each of the six will draw a card, dictating the order in which they shall face their webbed foe, wearing him down until he can finally be defeated. So why don't they just attack him all at once and get it over with? Hey, we've got an entire annual here to fill. Don't ask so many questions. Back in Forest Hills, Peter listlessly toys with his breakfast. That's no way to treat a stack of wheat cakes, son. Later, at school, the kids note Peter's absence. Looks like someone's cutting class. So where's old Pete? Why, he's having a this boy moment, kicking a can around down by the pier. However, instead of a lush George Martin instrumental, Peter's reverie is broken by crime fighters Giant Man and the Wasp, who, in all fairness, should be more worried about holding on to their own book and less about guest starring. The Hulk is gunning for you, Pym. Outside of the Daily Bugle, villains Electro and Sandman are set to abduct Betty Brant as part of their trap when the secretary crosses path with a concerned May Parker, looking for her nephew. Unfazed, the criminals abduct both women, bringing them back to the Secret Six's lair. So, was it love at first sight between Ock and May? Hard to say, but with what we know of the future's events, it's clear at least a precedent has been set. Meanwhile, at the Daily Bugle, the Vulture arrives with an ultimatum. The Sinister Six have captured Betty Brant, and if they want her back, Spider-Man had better show up to Building No. 4 of the Stark Electrical Plant. Or else. Unaware that his lead photographer is secretly the wall crawler, JJJ begins to search for Spider-Man, calling no less than the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, and the X-Men. Back then, everyone was in the Yellow Pages. Peter, meanwhile, struggles to reconcile his fate with his current state. With no spider powers, he's as good as dead. And yet, what choice does he have? Suiting up for perhaps the last time, he presumably catches a bus out to Long Island and the Stark Electrical Plant. And surprise, it's Electro. The costume villain unleashes a deadly barrage of energy at his terrified foe. However, instead of being singed to a cinder, Peter is only mostly singed. In fact, his spider powers have returned. Springing from the debris, he scuttles around the plant, getting closer to his foe. Drawing on his scientific acumen, Spidey deduces that if he grounds himself, he can absorb one of Electro's bolts without damage. Crackling with latent energy, the wallcrawler drops his foe with a powerful haymaker. Spidey retrieves Electro's location card, but as he does, Stark's security guard Iron Man shows up. "Where were you 5 minutes ago, pal?" After a little more back and forth with Jonah, we find Spidey at a location just across from the former World's Fair. The large park-like environment proves an ideal trap for Kraven the Hunter and his cats of prey. Drawing close, Kraven and his beasts pounce in unison, but Spidey's feeling pretty pumped and manages to block all three attacks. A deft application of webbing keeps the kitties from taking a bite out of him until Spidey can manage to pluck the card from Kraven's waistband. Ugh. Spidey swings off, desperate to get to his next location. Unfortunately, just then, Webhead runs into his old sparring partner, the Human Torch, who seems intent on slowing him down. When Spidey demands to know why, he discovers old Johnny just wants to lend a flaming hand. A nice gesture, but For Peter, this one is personal. Elsewhere, Ock observes his foe's progress, then heads out to the gals for a spot of tea. Spidey, meanwhile, has journeyed to his next location, and it's full of X-Men. Okay, they only look like X-Men. They are, in fact, highly sophisticated robots that fall apart quicker than a dollar store can opener. Hey, your product is only as good as your parts. Now able to cut loose, our hero makes short work of the X-automatons. Alerted to a nearby wall by his spider sense, Peter bursts through the camouflage and into the control room of Mysterio. Knowing he's now outmatched, the villain attempts to escape in a cloud of fog, but once again, Spidey's senses guide him unerringly to his target. Unfortunately, Mysterio has dropped his location card, allowing it to catch fire. Only some quick thinking by Spider-Man allows the damaged piece of paper to be read, one of the great little moments of this tale. Back in his office, the stress has begun to get to Jonah, leading to this delightful exchange. Spidey, meanwhile, has reached his next location, and it's a trap. The Sandman appears, and Spidey engages him, but all is not as it seems. The floor abruptly rises, steel panels snapping into place to form an escape-proof cage. Trapped, Spidey can barely dodge his foe's relentless fists, but luckily the airtight cage has caused the overexerted Sandman to pass out. Knowing a lucky break when he sees it, Spidey sprints off with a card to his next location. High above the city, the Vulture makes his play. He demands the teenage hero remove his web shooters, as those are what led to his previous downfall. Spidey complies, and the Vulture is quick to take advantage, spraying the surface Spidey is stuck to with a viscous oil. Using the power of his beating wings, the villain then blows Spidey from his perch, but our hero can still stick with his hands. Having taken this into account, the Vulture then lassos his struggling foe, wrestling him from where he clings. Thinking quick, Spidey frees himself, using the rope to lasso the Vulture in turn. Using his momentum, our hero is able to land on the villain's back, where he's quickly able to subdue him. I mean, the guy is 70 years old. Back in the city, Jameson suffers a crisis while Doc Ock readies himself for a guest. It appears his foe is even more resourceful than once thought, but after running the gauntlet, surely Spider-Man's defeat is inevitable. The web spinner appears then, thinking he's got the drop on his foe, but the Doc's arms are stealthily sneaking towards him. The intrepid teen is ensnared by the powerful coils, but manages to spring forward, clipping Doc on the jaw. Stunned, Ock temporarily loses focus, allowing Spidey the chance to extricate himself. He scampers off down a tunnel and escaping into the house proper, but it's not long before he's sprung a trap and is dropped into an enormous water-filled tank. It is here Dr. Octopus will have his final victory in the watery realm of his namesake. Slowed by the water and unable to use his climbing abilities, Spidey finds himself at a massive disadvantage. Doc's arms are inescapable, a fact the quick-thinking teen uses to his advantage. Spidey empties his web shooters into the oncoming tentacles, binding them into a rapidly forming net. The frantic thrashing exhausts Octopus, who Spidey then drags back to the surface. After humiliating his foe for good measure, Peter moves on, his spider sense leading to where Betty and Aunt May wait. And while the young secretary is relieved to see the wall crawler, May finds herself more confused than ever. It's time for your pills, dear. After seeing the gals out, Spidey unmasks and makes the scene as Peter Parker. I'm guessing JJJ is going to be pretty pissed when he learns Parker hasn't taken a single picture during this issue. The story ends on a surprisingly upbeat note, considering Ditko's disdain for happy endings. Maybe you can't win 'em all, but sometimes it's just the right way to wrap up an epic. While the Marvel Cinematic Universe was still decades in the future, readers were given a glimpse of that widescreen experience with this story. featuring some pulse-pounding pacing and spot-on characterization from writer Stan Lee and truly jaw-dropping action sequences and splash pages from artist Steve Ditko at the top of his game. This issue was an ideal distillation of what readers were getting in the regular title, only in a more concentrated dose. The book was a big surprise, with Marvel attempting to catch lightning in a bottle again a year later with Amazing Spider-Man Annual #2. And while that book featured the same creative team, along with Lee and Ditko's Doctor Strange cast, it fell short of the wide-eyed excitement and breathless energy inherent in that first annual. And this stands to reason. Original ideas are rare birds indeed, even when they follow the example of comics from decades before. All of the bad guys can only team up for the first time once. After that, no matter how good the story, it's going to be seen as more of the same. But we'll always have Paris. Fast forward to 1975, and hey, here's me, a hardcore Spider-Man fan. Granted, I wasn't old enough to buy my own comics yet, but I already knew what I liked. So did Marvel, as they reprinted Amazing Spider-Man Annual #1 in this oversized treasury format. Love 'em or hate 'em, these treasury editions provided many newer readers with their first exposure to classic Marvel stories of a decade earlier. This book was a source of endless fascination to young Mink. The oversized Ditko artwork blew my mind, especially those full-size pages. At the time, there was simply nothing like it. As I said earlier, whereas one villain was great, 6 was even better. In fact, my young head threatened to explode. However, there was a complication. You see, at the time, I didn't own this book, but an older boy down the street did. Being the manipulator that I was, I'd show up to ostensibly play with his younger brother, but eventually worm my way back to this particular comic. What can I say? Stan's plan worked. I was hooked, and there was no going back. And here we are, decades later, and I'm still a webhead. Do I follow the new books and movies? Nah. For me, the old comics are more than enough. It's not just about the character, it's about the creators. Lee and Ditko, despite their contentious relationship, produced some of the greatest comics of the Silver Age. It's this intangible sense that compels me, those spells woven so long ago, still infused with the power of that magical relationship. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing this video to your social network platform. We're grinding towards 1,000 subs, so every view helps. I'm Jason Mink, and I hope to see you next week at breakfast.